Welcome to the Bio 270 lectures. In this week's lecture, we'll be covering chapters 1 and 2. Each week, I'll start out the lecture with a list of objectives, and these are a list of things that you should know when you get to the end of the chapter. And I use these objectives, I pull from these to make the test questions. So what I would do is look over these at the beginning of the chapter, go through the lecture, and then see if you can answer these questions when you get to the end of the lecture. So for this week's objectives, number 1, describe the levels of ecological organization. So for example, moving from an individual to a population to a community, and what these means, and be able to give an example of each. Explain what was learned from MacArthur's study on warblers. Explain how Davis's studies of pollen help us to understand how plants and animals respond to climate change. List the steps of the scientific method. And our objectives for chapter 2 are to explain what a biome is and list the main terrestrial biomes. Explain how the uneven heating on Earth by the sun and the tilt of the Earth lead to different seasonal variations in climate. Explain how rising, moving, and falling air lead to different climates on Earth. Explain how the Coriolis effect leads to prevailing wind directions. Be able to read a climate diagram and determine what the average monthly temperature, average monthly precipitation, months when temperature above and below freezing, and the meaning of the different colors of shading such as dark blue, gold, etc. Be able to list the layers/horizons of a soil profile, and be able to match climate, soil types, and human influences with the corresponding biome type. So section 1.1 is an overview of ecology. So let's look at first what ecology is. Your class is called ecosystems. Essentially, it's the same thing as ecology. So our goal of this course is to study the relationships between organisms and the environment. The simple definition does not convey the extreme breadth of this discipline. An ecosystem includes all organisms living in an area and the physical environment with which these organisms interact. So when you're studying ecology, you're looking at a huge variety of things that influence the organisms in their environment. The main components of an ecosystem include water, soil and rocks, the atmosphere, and living organisms. So this picture was entered into the 2015 National Geographic Photo Contest. The photographer was attempting to photograph jellyfish, and this young cormorant bird flew into the picture. And the bird was diving into the jellyfish to eat the fish that hide within the jellyfish. Now, understanding ecology means looking at the big picture and how all of these elements, so just in this example, it would be the seawater, the jellyfish, the fish, the cormorants, how all of these things interact to survive. This picture is a little hard to see here, but it's a figure from page 2 in your text, and it shows the different levels of organization that you can look at when ecologists are studying something, all the way down from looking at a single individual at the bottom, all the way up to the whole biosphere or anywhere on Earth where living things live. So small scale to very broad scale. So we have, as I mentioned, at the bottom is the individual. So you might just be looking at, in this picture, a certain zebra and things going on with that particular animal. You could look at a population, which would be looking at a group of zebras living in one area. So a group of one species living in one area, it's your population. You could be looking at a community, and that's a group of different living things that live in one area. So for example, you might be looking at any of the giraffes and zebras and other things that live in a certain area and how they interact. You could be looking at an ecosystem, so going a little more broad scale to maybe all the interactions of things within a certain forest region or within a certain lake or ocean. A landscape, so going even a little bit bigger, bigger area all the way to a region, again getting even bigger, so you might be looking at like the Western United States or Southern Africa, so some larger region, and then you could be looking at the whole biosphere, so things interacting on the scale of the whole Earth. Your text gives a couple different examples to show you what ecology is, and one of the examples of a study in ecology is MacArthur's study of 5 different warbler species that live in spruce trees in the forests of North America. And his theory that he was testing predicted that 2 species with identical ecological requirements, which means they live in the same place, eat the same food, that species that have identical requirements could not coexist indefinitely. They call this, if you remember from environmental science, the theory of competitive exclusion. And this just means that if 2 species are living in the same exact niche, having the same role in the ecosystem, same food they eat, same place they live, then one is going to outcompete the other. And one of these species will either have to move on or find a new way to live. And so what he found is that the warblers there, a way that they found to coexist is that they live in different parts of, they feed in different parts of the tree. So some warblers feed on this, upper outer edge, some warblers feed more toward the center, and each species had a different place that they fed in the tree, and this allowed them to coexist. Now this would be an example of looking at a smaller scale of ecology, looking at a couple different species. And the next example here, looking at climate change and ecological change, looks at a much broader scale. So a lot of environmental changes occur over a large scale. One example of an environmental change is when the climate changes. So when, in years where there's a drought or when it's hotter or colder than usual, plants and animals have to try to adapt to those conditions. So a study by Davis monitored plant pollen deposited in lake sediments in the Appalachian Mountains. And they found that during climate change, plants change their geographic distribution. So they change either where they are so that the conditions better suit what they need, or they undergo adaptations allowing them to survive in the new conditions. So let's say that an area becomes hotter and drier. The plants that are lower in elevation might die off, and the plants might slowly, as seeds blow, move to higher elevations to where it's a little bit cooler than what they're used to. Climate change changes are also seen in animals after climate change. It's a lot easier for an animal to move than a plant. So a plant can't just walk to a new location that feels cooler. They have to wait for their seeds to get blown to more favorable locations. But animals can a little more easily move to a place where the climate conditions are better for them. So this leads to the saying, move, adapt, or die. So those are 3 options that something can do when conditions change. So let's say it gets really hot and dry. An animal can either move to a better place, they can adapt, find a way to adapt to that hotter, drier conditions, or they don't do either one of those, then they would die if they tried to stay where the conditions are unfavorable. So as I mentioned, there's 3 options that something can do: move, adapt, or die. And an adaptation is a trait that an organism has that allows it to live in the environment that it's living in. The fox, for example, this fox is adapted to living in snow. You can see, for one, just by its color, that it blends into the snow. How would the fox need to change if the snow began to melt from the area where it lived? Do you think the fox would be more likely to move or adapt? And so the fox, if the snow began to melt, the fox probably wouldn't blend into the environment. So most likely the only foxes that would survive are those that move to a snowier area and kind of follow the snow, because the foxes that don't follow the snow are not going to blend in very well, and they're much more likely to be eaten and killed off. Okay, next we're going to look at Chapter 2. Chapter 2 starts out with an example of how understanding ecology can help land managers to make decisions that help protect species. And the example that they give you is the Guanacaste tree in Costa Rica, and trying to aid restoration efforts in this area, they needed to understand how this tree has its seeds dispersed, because usually animals will eat seeds, and then them eating the seeds moves the seeds to various locations and helps disperse the seeds and helps the Guanacaste trees to continue to grow in new places. What they found is that at the time they studied this tree, there were no animals there that were large enough to eat these really large seeds. And the more they studied the tree, they realized that most of the really large mammals that used to eat these seeds went extinct tens of thousands of years ago. And then there was a time when, so they went extinct tens of thousands of years ago, and then they saw that when people brought cattle and horses to the area, that cattle and horses acted for a long time as dispersers. So even though they weren't native animals, they became important to dispersing the seeds. And when there were no longer cattle and horses in the area, there was nothing left to disperse the seeds. So their plan was to bring cattle and horses into the area that could act as to disperse the seeds. So this was an example of looking at the whole ecology surrounding this plant and what it needs in order to manage the area with these plants. So as you can see, the figure here in your text shows that by bringing in, there used to be, animals, large mammals that could disperse the seeds, but they went extinct. And so now they brought in new large mammals to help disperse the seeds. Section 2.1 looks at large-scale patterns of climate variation and why we have different climates in different areas on the Earth. So the spherical shape and tilt of the Earth's axis cause uneven heating of the Earth's surface. And the uneven heating drives air circulation patterns and consequently precipitation patterns. So what happens is that warm, moist air rises near the equator, and as it rises, it cools, condenses, and then rain falls. So at the equator, you have very warm due to the shape of the Earth, being closer to the sun there, and you have warm air tends to rise, and then, as I said, as the air rises, it gets colder as it goes higher up into the atmosphere, and as it gets colder, it cannot hold that moisture, so the air will condense and the rain falls. This is why we get rainforests near the equator. So the air, once it gets dry, the air will stop rising, and it gets dry and cool, it stops rising. The air is blown then north and south towards about 30 degrees latitude, and the air will draw moisture out of the land since it's very, very dry. So instead of raining at 30 degrees north and south, you get the moisture being sucked up into the air, and it becomes very, very dry, and that's why we have deserts found near 30 degrees north and south. So all other climate regions are determined by this rise, movement, and fall of air. So what you can see is you have the tropical rainforests. You have the air that's hot will rise up. It will cause the rain to fall out. The air gets blown north, sucks up moisture out of the air, and that's why you get deserts, this 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south, and then the air will fall back, lower back down, and so you have these cycling patterns of the air, kind of in these circular patterns, causing to get rain at some spots and deserts at the other end of that circular pattern, and it does that all the way around the Earth. So another large-scale weather pattern that we notice is the movement of winds. So we have winds moving kind of in this direction here, and winds moving south, moving the westerlies moving this way, northeast trade winds moving this way. And the reason that the winds seem to move at an angle is not because the winds are actually blowing at that angle. They're actually blowing directly north and south, but the Earth is spinning, and so as the Earth spins, the air moves with that spin of the Earth. And so this is called the Coriolis effect, and that causes the apparent deflection of winds clockwise in the northern hemisphere and counterclockwise in the southern hemisphere. So you'll see a lot of climate diagrams in this chapter that look like the picture there on the right, and especially when it's describing biomes, it'll look at a climate diagram for what's typical for that biome or that region. And climate diagrams summarize climate information using this standardized structure. They have temperature plotted on the left vertical axis, so you have your temperature here. You have precipitation plotted on the right vertical axis. And then you have your months down here. So as you can see, looking at this chart, 10 degrees Celsius would be equivalent on this chart to about 20 millimeters of precipitation. And the relative position of the lines reflects water availability. So there's adequate moisture for plant growth when the precipitation line is above the temperature line. So you have in blue your precipitation line here, and then in red your temperature line. And wherever the blue line is above the red line, that means you have enough moisture for plants to grow. If you'll notice, there's red shading on the months here, and in areas with red shading, that means that the minimum temperature for the month is above freezing. So that means it's not, it never gets freezing during these months. And if there's no shading, that means that it does get below freezing at some time of the day in these months. So if you're looking for time when normally your plants are going to be growing the best, it's when the temperature is warmer here in these red months. And again, when the blue line is above the red line. So after reading the chapter, test yourself. Can you remember what each of these shaded regions means? So make sure you remember what an area that's blue versus red means. And then on a test, be prepared to answer in a matching question if each of these regions corresponds to dry conditions, moist conditions, freezing conditions, etc. So make sure you know that in any area that has a bubble here, you could use this as a study guide. There is a matching question on this on your test for what each of these bubbles would be pointing to. Next, let's look at soil. And soil is the foundation of all the terrestrial or land biomes. So what that means is that soil is kind of the base that determines what things, aside from temperature and water, soil is another important factor determining what can live and grow in an area. Soil, the definition of soil, is a complex mixture of living and non-living material. So when you look at soil, you're looking at the rocks that have been ground up, along with ground up, dead plant material, animal material, so anything that's in the ground that's living, non-living in that kind of upper layer of the earth. Soil is classified based on vertical layering, or what we call soil horizons, and the profile provides a snapshot of the soil structure, and it's constantly changing. So soil is always, getting blown off, new soil being washed in, new plants and animals growing. So let's look at the soil horizons. The O horizon is what they call the organic layer, and it's freshly fallen organic material, and it's the most superficial or the top layer. And the term organic in science, in this context, means that it's from a living thing, so plants or animals that have fallen to the ground on that very upper level. The A horizon is a mixture of minerals, clay, silt, and sand. The B horizon is a mixture of clay, humus, and other materials leached from the A horizon and often contains plant roots. The C horizon contains weathered parent or rock material. And here's a picture here. So you can look at that O, this upper layer of organic or living things. The A horizon has soil mixed with some living things. The B horizon is where things from above are leached down, and the C horizon is your rock starting to get broken up and weathered down rock fragments. And this layer here, the C horizon, also oftentimes lies on bedrock. The next section of the chapter covers biomes, and the different biomes listed in your chapter, the ones that you'll be picking from to do your biome presentations on. And a biome is distinguished primarily by their predominant plants and are associated with particular climates. So biomes occur in different climate areas, and those areas usually tend to have a similar group of plants in them. So for example, in all deserts, you'll find similar type plants. In forests, you'll find similar type plants. We're going to go through those different biomes as the last part of this lecture. So geographic and seasonal variations in temperature and precipitations are fundamental components. So that means the amount of rainfall and the temperature of the biome tends to determine everything that can live within that biome. First, let's look at tropical rainforests. Most of the rainforests occur within 10 degrees latitude of the equator, so centered around the equator. There is little temperature variation between the months, which means it's pretty similar temperature all year round. Annual rainfall of 2,000 to 4,000 millimeters, relatively evenly distributed throughout the year. And all of this rainfall quickly leaches soil nutrients. Mycorrhizae, or soil bacteria, help to gather nutrients in this region, and organisms add vertical dimension. So essentially you have things living on the ground level, you have really tall trees, and vines and other plants can grow up those trees, and so you have that vertical dimension just means that there's things growing at all different heights because of those tall trees there. The rainforests harbor staple foods and medicines for the world's human population, and it's increasingly exploited. So here's the climate diagrams for some different rainforests. If you notice in all of these, the precipitation here line is above the temperature line. And so if you remember, that means that it's optimal time for plant growth due to the amount of rainfall all throughout the year, and it's also never below freezing in any given month. So lots of moisture and temperatures always above freezing is typical of the tropical rainforests. Next, let's look at tropical dry forests. These are usually located between 10 and 25 degrees latitude. So you had your rainforest from 0 to 10, that equator region. This is just beyond that, but before you get to the desert. Climate is more seasonal than a tropical rainforest. Soils are generally richer in nutrients, but vulnerable to erosion. They share many plant and animal species with tropical rainforests since they are adjacent to the tropical rainforests. They're heavily settled by humans with extensive clearing for agriculture. And there's a picture there of your tropical dry forest. And your climate diagram for the tropical dry forest. So as you can see here, you have your precipitation varies throughout the year. It's not as high all year long. There are times of the year when the precipitation falls below the temperature line, which would mean it would be drier during those months and not as suitable for plant growth. But you are still above freezing throughout the whole year. Next biome we have is the tropical savanna biome, and the tropical savanna usually occurs just a little bit north or south of the tropical dry forest, but still within 10 to 20 degrees of the equator. Climate alternates between wet and dry seasons. There's drought associated with the dry seasons that leads to lightning-caused wildfires. Soils have lower water permeability. That means the water does not seep into the soil as quickly. The saturated soil keeps trees out. Landscape is more two-dimensional with increasing pressure to produce livestock. So two-dimensional, meaning that things tend to be, since there's no big trees, all the things growing are closer to the ground. Here's a picture of your tropical savanna. Your climate diagram for the tropical savanna. So here you have probably typically think of that as a lot of like your African region. That would be the tropical savanna. It does occur in parts of Australia and South America here. but you can see similar to our last biome, sometimes the precipitation is below the temperature, so not good for plant growth, and sometimes it's above the temperature, so good for plant growth. Still very warm, once you're still pretty close to the equator, never freezing at all in the year. And next we have the desert biome. So the desert tends to occur just around in kind of a region around 30 degrees north and south latitude. It occupies about 20% of the land surface, or sorry, the Earth's land surface. Water loss usually exceeds precipitation. Soils usually have extremely low amounts of organic matter. Not a lot is growing there due to the dryness, so not a lot of organic matter goes into the soil. Again, organic matter is living material that gets mixed in with the soil, like leaves and things like that. Plant cover ranges from sparse to absent. Animal abundance is low, but biodiversity may be high. So what that means is if you look out, you're not going to see a lot of animals, but there might be, if you were to count the number of different species, there might be a lot of different species living there, just not very many of each one of those species. Strong behavioral adaptations, so things that animals do behavior-wise, like only coming out at times of the day when it's a little cooler, coming out when it's not as dry, or having ways to deal with water loss would be some examples of behavioral adaptations. Human intrusion is increasing. A picture of the desert. And your climate diagrams for the desert. So most places, a lot of the desert, your temperature is going to be above your precipitation, which means not favorable for most plant growth. So you do see some things like the cactus species that are adapted to living in those dry conditions, but most things are not going to grow when your temperature is above your precipitation line. The next biome is the Mediterranean shrubland and woodland, and this occurs in all continents except Antarctica. Has a cool and moist climate in the fall, winter, and spring, but can be really hot and dry in the summer. It has fragile soils, so they're easily damaged, and moderate fertility, so moderate amount of nutrients needed for plants to grow there. Trees and shrubs are typically evergreen, which means they don't lose their leaves in the winter. A lot of fire-resistant plants due to the fire regime, so they tend to get fires that come through and burn in these areas frequently, and so a lot of the plants have some kind of fire-resistant strategy, and a long history of human intrusion in this region. A lot of it's been cleared for agriculture. Picture of what the Mediterranean woodland and shrubland might look like. And our climate diagrams. So you can see that there are parts of the year where the rainfall is above the temperature line, usually in the winter months, and then in the fall, spring, and summer. A lot of the other year it's fairly dry, and the temperature line is above precipitation, so not as good for plant growth in the summer months here. But still, as you can see, the temperatures here above freezing really throughout the year. Next biome is a temperate grassland. It has extremely widespread distribution. The annual rainfall is 300 to 1,000 millimeters. It experiences periodic droughts. Soils tend to be extremely nutrient rich and deep. And it's thoroughly dominated by herbaceous vegetation. So herbaceous would be plants that are not woody, so smaller, more leafy plants that don't have a big woody stem or trunk. Has large roaming ungulates, so things like bison, pronghorn in North America, or wild horses in Eurasia. So a lot of where there used to be bison, we now have cattle in these areas due to a lot of grass and feed for the cattle. There's a picture here of your temperate grassland with bison. And your climate diagrams for the temperate grasslands. So a lot of the year your precipitation is above your temperature line, so good for plant growth. It does at this region, since you're getting a little bit further north or south. You are getting some months where it's freezing in the kind of fall and winter months, and then your summer, spring, and a little bit into fall, you have your months that don't get below freezing. Next is temperate forest or old growth forests. Majority of these lie between 40 and 50 degrees latitude. The rainfall averages 650 to 3,000 millimeters. It has fertile soil, long growing seasons dominated by deciduous plants. These are plants that lose their leaves in the winter. Short growing seasons dominated by conifers. So things like pine trees, fir. Biomass production can be very high, so there can be a lot of plant growth in these areas. And many of these are major human population centers, so a lot of people tend to live in this biome. Picture of our temperate old growth forest here. And our climate diagrams for that. So a lot of the year your precipitation is above the temperature. Sometimes it can drop below, but pretty good growing season. And a few months there that freeze, but a lot of the year that doesn't freeze. Next biome is the boreal forest or the taiga. It's confined to the northern hemisphere, covers 11% of the Earth's land area. It has thin acidic soils that are low in fertility, so not really good for growth here. Generally dominated by evergreen conifers, relatively high animal density, and historically low levels of human intrusion. There's a picture here of the boreal forest. And your climate diagram. The rainfall tends to be above the precipitation, sometimes not by much, but usually it's just a little bit above the precipitation. And a lot of the year, you can see we're moving much further north here. And remember, again, it's only in the northern hemisphere. And so as you move that much further north, you have a lot of months in the year where it freezes at some time in the month. So your summer months, not, but a lot of the year it does freeze. And next we have the tundra. Covers most of the lands north of the Arctic Circle. Climate is typically cool and dry with short summers. Has 200 to 600 millimeters of precipitation. Low decomposition rate, so things don't break down very quickly. For one, because the cooler temperatures, things just don't break down as quickly. Supports substantial numbers of native mammals. And human intrusion is historically low, but increasing as resources become scarce. Of the tundra. And our climate diagram for the tundra. So as you see, as we have moved way, way further north here in that region, you have only a few months where it doesn't freeze, and most of the rest of the year it is freezing. Okay, our next biome are mountains. And these are sort of biomes that can occur within another biome. So you might have the region around the mountain that's a different type of biome. And so mountains can occur in many different biomes, but mountains tend to have sort of their own unique features due to the increase in elevation in that mountain. Okay, so mountain ranges in Europe and Asia generally run east to west. As you can see these here running east to west. Mountain ranges in North and South America generally run north to south. And not always, but that's sort of the general trend in those areas. Mountains are built by geological processes, and therefore they're concentrated in belts where there's a lot of geologic activity. So when the land gets pushed together, those mountains form, the land gets pushed up into that mountain shape, and that occurs in areas where you have a lot of geologic activity. Climate changes with the elevation and latitude. So as you go further
north or south, or you go higher up in elevation, you'll get more of a colder type climate. Soils are generally well drained and thin. The flora and fauna, or plants and animals, change the higher up in elevation you go. So certain things are adapted to live at different elevations. Historically, mountains are used as a source of raw materials for human settlements, so like timber, for example. Okay, so that's a general breakdown of all the biomes. So in your presentation, you're going to be giving a more detailed description of whatever biome you chose, and hopefully have lots of good pictures to help show what the biomes look like. So once you've chosen the biome that you want to do in the week 1 discussion, you can get started on your presentation at any time. And that is the end of our week 1 lecture covering chapters 1 and 2. Next week we'll be covering chapters 3 and 4.